For most of martial arts' existence in the West, it has largely been a lower and middle class project. It is something that the folk do, and I believe that history, whether consciously or not, has had a profound effect on the sorts of assumptions we as Westerners make about what martial arts are. Specifically, we see martial arts as having grown out of competition. This is largely true in our context. Martial arts in the West have essentially always been sport. Sometimes that sport was mixed with ritual, and other times the sport was used to condition men of war. But the fundamental substrate of Western martial arts has been one of victors and champions before anything else. Beyond this is how we tend to imagine the quintessential martial artist. He's from a rough neighborhood, and is, as a matter of course, rough around the edges personally, too. He might not be the brightest or the wisest or even the most naturally gifted, but his soul is made of grit and perseverance. He's scrappy. He will probably train in some hole in the wall gym that is about as much in debt as it is unkempt and obscure. Within its walls, there is no hierarchy except through martial conquest. Only the grizzled old coach, a failed mirror of the young protagonist, sits outside that formula. Despite these circumstances, however, the young prospect becomes the perfect underdog, eventually arriving at undeniable victory after having transformed in both overall skill and physicality. He is not only martially dangerous, but athletic, muscular, and in his prime. In his success, his old coach is redeemed of his own inability to achieve such heights in his own prime. We tend to allow our historical and cultural heritage, both real and imaginary, as in the aforementioned narrative, to color our expectations of what to expect in a martial arts space. This tends to get people into a heap of trouble when training martial arts of foreign origin. For the sake of this video, and because it's the nation that I'm most familiar with, I want to focus on Japan. For we in the West, we tend to glorify the Ronin, the wandering, masterless samurai out to carve his name into history by growing a large resume of dual victories. I don't think it's a mistake that this is the part of Japanese history that captivates and resonates with us. You don't need to squint too hard to see all of our favorite tropes. The wandering samurai is poor. He sits outside the traditional hierarchies. He is necessarily quite young, and most importantly, he lives and dies in accordance to his martial success. His existence is free and, crucially, honest. Honesty and authenticity are, especially in today's market, possibly what martial artists in the West value most. Indeed, there is no faking success when a single failure means death. But let's put a pin in this for now and circle back to the wandering samurai later. The first major distinction that I want to draw when considering Japanese martial arts relative to its Western counterparts is that their origins are aristocratic. And in fact, eras of martial arts being for the general public tend to be an exception to the rule in Japanese history rather than the reverse. Let's start at the beginning, though. Martial arts really got their start in Japan with archery and sumo. On one hand, archery was practiced by court officials as far back as Japan's written record, really. While these officials did have contests, the archery also had a ritual and aesthetic dimension to it. Arguably even a political dimension, as very important people were naturally at these events. In fact, basically only important people were at these events. Sumo, on the other hand, was practiced by commoners, but they were sponsored and organized by the elites. Sumo might have been filled with commoner practitioners, but the observers, the audience, the benefactors were all aristocrats. Similarly, even actual warfare this far back in history was dominated by horseback archery, meaning you had to first be able to afford a horse, which the commoners could absolutely not do at the time. Now, an understandable criticism of all this is that basically all of our historical sources come from the upper class, which might just make it seem like martial arts had their origins here. Basically, you could argue it's a bias of sources. While I'm not arguing that commoners never practiced sumo or never did archery on their own time, I would argue that commoners simply did not have the time or resources to institutionalize these skills as the aristocrats did. Even in these very early pre-modern years, we begin to see families devoted to archery as an art unto itself and the makings of early schools, for example. Even practical archery in the context of hunting was largely an aristocratic leisure activity that had to be done in a specific fashion, as many religious taboos orbited the practice and those needed to be observed. If we fast forward considerably to the height of the samurai, we see martial arts schools in a more recognizable form come into existence in the waning years of the Warring States period. What tends to be overlooked, however, is that not many samurai were actually practicing in these schools. This is especially true relative to the vast armies being fielded. The people in these schools were, once again, generally well-to-do, or at the very least, well-connected. Even at this earliest moment, training was a supplementary activity with a strong emphasis on personal development, and at its core, it was an elite leisure activity. Where does that leave our wandering samurai, the ronin from earlier, then? Well, to be certain, many duels to the death did take place. That being said, these were a lot rarer than people tend to imagine. Most duels did not end in death. Similarly, most dojo storms were less about proving oneself and more about seeking out room and board. Yes, martial artists came and fought, but almost always stopped short of embarrassing the head teacher. I lump these two things together, dojo storming and duels, because they are both forms of musha shugyo, or martial pilgrimage. The problem with the Western interpretation of Musha Shugyo is that it tends to be taken at complete face value. While yes, it was absolutely a trip to grow as a martial artist and winning in combat was central to it, it was also, and arguably more importantly, about growing a resume and networking. It might surprise people to learn that most wandering, masterless samurai didn't actually want to be wandering, masterless samurai, and certainly they did not want to be poor. In fact, I'd argue that what made Musashi so notorious in his own time was the fact that he couldn't really seem to read between the lines himself. He approached his Musha Shugyo in the way that the West tends to imagine it, as a sort of competition with everyone else, when in fact, his cutting a swath through everything was actually seen as a break in the norm. Musashi somewhat famously struggled to find employ for himself. Now, while he eventually did find an employer, it was a relatively provincial position and quite humble, considering he might have been the greatest duelist Japan ever produced. The tragedy of Musashi is that he kind of seems to have missed the point. He was so focused on being the best swordsman that he failed to realize that the point wasn't being the best swordsman, it was about being an employable one. The point I've been making here is that a lot of questions about modern Japanese martial arts can actually be best understood just by knowing some very surface level history. Why are Japanese systems always so formal, hierarchical, and ritualized? Well, because aristocratic life, the womb of Japanese martial arts themselves, was and is formal, hierarchical, and ritualized. Even in its most rebellious phase, that of the wandering, masterless samurai, martial arts in Japan were generally used as a tool for social mobility and actually integrating into the system rather than trying to carve out an alternative lifestyle. We see this especially in the early Tokugawa period as samurai begin to convert into scholars, policymakers, artists, and literati. I will point out, however, that Japanese martial arts have had two eras in which martial arts were deeply popular. And I mean popular here in the sense that the general public were the main participants and benefactors. The first would be during the Tokugawa era's decline. As the samurai class decayed and became mostly impoverished, they began to sell their knowledge to the lower classes as a way to make ends meet, especially the rising merchant class. This meant that the luxury activity that was historically the dominion of the warrior elite became a layman experience. The second era is, well, right now. And I don't think I really need to spend any time qualifying why that is. You're living it. I want to also discuss here Judo and Aikido because they're sort of useful case studies. Judo came to us essentially as Kano's personal project to rehabilitate the public's view of martial arts. In his time, these systems were seen as low class and something for ruffians. In a sense, that was probably mostly true. Kano, after all, was inheriting that era of martial arts which the samurai had sold their systems to the laymen. Of course, by the time Kano founded his martial art, Judo, the samurai class had already been abolished, but the end of the shogunate was very much still in living memory. Kano's strategy was twofold. First, he would modernize the systems. What this largely meant was peeling back all of the esotericism from the martial arts and substituting it with no-nonsense explanations and a scientific method. What I call modernization here might as well just be a synonym, though, for westernization. And perhaps that's why Judo is, even to this day, probably one of the more approachable Japanese martial arts for, like, an American middle-class person. Second, he would explicitly target the upper class when marketing his art. Now, hold on before you type up a comment, because I'd bet the more knowledgeable among you thought I was going to say he brought Judo to the school system. He did do that, but not at first. Something to keep in mind here is that westernization, which is what Kano was explicitly tapping into when constructing Judo, was not that popular in 1882 when Judo began. In fact, the popular embrace of westernization among Japanese people would not come until well over 20 years later. It was only after 1905 and Japan's defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War that the public really started to get on board with the idea. After all, the process had clearly made Japan into a global superpower with arguably the strongest navy in the world at the time. In 1882, however, it was really only the ruling elite who were driving the westernization policy that it believed in. For them, a martial art that mirrored their ideology was extremely attractive. This begs the question as to whether or not Kano was a believer in westernization or if he built his system specifically to attract the type of sponsors he wanted or actually needed. Personally, I think Kano was a true believer in the westernization project. He himself was fairly highborn and, without a doubt, very educated. At the very least, Kano's father was an educated high priest, a status that was certainly far from being a given in that time period. All this being said, two things can be true at once. Kano most likely believed in westernization, but he certainly wasn't about to start complaining that implanting that belief into Judo attracted wealthy sponsors. And indeed, many of Judo's first practitioners were also students of Kano's private school, and those students were, you might have guessed, the sons of very influential people. In other words, although westernization was a new twist on the martial arts scene, the focus on aristocratic clientele was very much a return to form. Then some 40-odd years later, Aikido came along. I think the core feature of Aikido is, once again, how it coincidentally aligned with the ideology of the ruling elite. In the lead up to Japan's fascistic turn, the school of Kokugaku, often translated as nativism, rose to prominence. While nativism actually did lay genuine scholarly groundwork for later cultural studies that we still use today, it had, at the time, a teeny problem of being pumped full of ultra nationalist fervor. What began as an academic interrogation of Japanese history and culture very rapidly morphed into a tool to craft the narrative that Japan was the world's chosen nation filled with the world's chosen people. Suddenly, westernization wasn't all that cool anymore, at least not in any realm that didn't involve technological advancement. Loanwords began to be swapped to quote unquote more Japanese counterparts. Foreign philosophies were replaced with native ones, with special emphasis on state Shinto and its pantheon. In this ecosystem, it really shouldn't be surprising that Aikido's founder, Ueshiba, adopted a lot of nativist language and philosophy. He routinely referenced the Kojiki and Nihongi, texts central to Shinto. In many ways, Aikido was, at least ideologically, a kokugaku or nativist martial art. If not in substance, then at least in aesthetics. And wouldn't you know it, Aikido really began to boom as it attracted wealthy sponsors with deep government and ultranationalist connections. Once again, Japanese martial arts proved to largely be an elite project. Hey, this is editing Tengu. This wasn't in the script, but I did want to address something because occasionally I get people saying, well, actually, Kano and Ueshiba were both pretty poor. And this is only sort of maybe partially true. If you're looking at their bank accounts, then yes, neither of these individuals were ever all that particularly wealthy. But if you consider their network of sponsors, they were never going to be allowed to fail. There's always people bailing these guys out, and while both were in debt in various times of their lives, they were never really left wanting or anything like that. In fact, both men seem to have at least started out their business prospects being pretty well to do, at least upper middle class. So this whole idea that these guys were like super poor and came from really humble beginnings just largely isn't true. Both Ueshiba and Kano did pretty well for themselves and were so well connected, there was just no way they were ever going to fall into real financial problems so long as the establishment held together. Now, of course, in Ueshiba's case, it did not hold together thanks to a little thing called World War II, and Aikido really had to reinvent itself. I don't think Judo had to bend over backwards as hard because, well, it was already kind of in alignment with Western values thanks to its initial push for Westernization and all that. Plus, Judo is really quick to embrace international competition for better or worse. All right, I just wanted to get that out of the way in case people were going to come in here arguing that these guys were somehow like blue collar startups, and they just weren't. Back to your scheduled programming, editing Tengu out. I would suggest that Ueshiba's marketing tactics go even farther into the realm of optics. On screen now is an image of Lao Tzu from the Ming Dynasty, a mytho-historical founder of Taoism. In China, the origins of various martial arts are attributed to Taoist immortals, and Lao Tzu is often the template by which their appearance is derived. Now, on screen is a Japanese painting of a Taoist immortal as imagined in the early 1800s, and finally, here is a photo of Ueshiba Morihei. I feel like the comparison I'm drawing here should speak for itself. With whom would this imagery be most meaningful, though? Of course, the elites, who were without a doubt trained in the Chinese classics. While, to my knowledge, it's never been explicitly written down anywhere that Ueshiba styled himself purposefully after Taoist immortals, I feel it is tough to deny when the fashion of elderly men in Ueshiba's own time was typically something like this. Even the criticism of Aikido being dance-like feels out of place to me when Ueshiba himself performed Kagura Mai regularly in dojo spaces. A ritualized dance, mind you. Even today, Aikido is practiced annually before the Aiki Shrine, which feels very much like a mirror to ritual dances performed at most other shrines for various purposes on various times of the year. To be clear, it does appear that Ueshiba always meant for his art to be a functional one, martially speaking, but I think it's a bit of a delusion to just ignore all these parallels and connections. Aikido is clearly meant, at least in Ueshiba's time, to be a sort of ritual outgrowth of state Shinto or something along those lines. How does any of this prove that history is important to martial arts, though? I still maintain that knowing a bunch of martial arts history won't make you a better fighter. That being said, it will help you make informed decisions. I've seen a lot of people over the years join a Japanese martial arts dojo and almost immediately feel at odds with the formalism and the ritual that gets practiced in them. But by knowing just a little bit of history, you can both understand why it's there and see it coming from a mile away before you ever invest a dime. And keep in mind, this is just a survey history too. All the formalism in lining up and wearing matching uniforms might have started with aristocratic culture, but it certainly received a bit of a militaristic makeover during the 1930s and 40s. Much of the soldier-like discipline can be traced back to that era, for example. I'm not going super deep in this video, it's not a college course. What I see a lot of online these days are complaints about grifters and being deceived. Indeed, these types of people are out there, and I sympathize with folks who do feel like they're not getting the product that they paid for. Sometimes even teachers at dojos have cherry-picked a history that most speaks to them either through ignorance or maliciousness. The reality, however, is that about an hour of due diligence should cue you into pretty much any problem, or at least generally what to expect at a dojo. I have sometimes received comments in which people say that I can't expect people to do that due diligence. However, that sole responsibility instead falls on dojos and teachers to properly educate people. While I am certainly in the camp that believes teachers should be educated in the history of their martial art, it also is not their sole responsibility. For one thing, you would not buy a car that you didn't have a history of, or at least I hope you wouldn't. If you're going to train in a martial art, you're staring down hundreds or even thousands of hours of time investment, and not even to mention the financial costs. A bit of research is absolutely a reasonable expectation from consumers, especially today, a time when really solid research is more accessible than ever before, usually completely free too. To be perfectly honest, if you're going to buy something without doing your homework on it, I kind of find myself aligning with the school of hard knocks. You're just setting yourself up to be scammed. You can blame it on deceivers all you like, but ultimately, it was you who blindly made the transaction. In short, history matters in martial arts because it helps you make informed decisions and just have a better time. Also, I generally really try to stay in my lane on these kinds of things, but I really do think it begs the question, so I will briefly mention it. If you are not willing to do a little bit of due diligence and research on something that you are interested in, then I'm honestly a little bit concerned about society, because what about less interesting things that are actually of more importance? What about your health and your fitness? What about your finances? What about understanding the political process? Are you not researching these things either? I mean, my channel isn't about that, so I'll leave it at that, but it is a little concerning. This is something you already kind of have an interest in, so a couple minutes to make sure that you understand it properly really should be no big deal. What about things that you're not interested in, but are like really important to civic life? Just a little concerning, but I won't stare too long into that abyss. Now, of course, there are other reasons for knowing your history. Knowing it can give your training texture and give you a sense of place within a larger generational project. Absolutely, this is true. But in terms of pure practicality, I think being able to make informed decisions about how to invest your resources and set your expectations is a very clear reason for knowing a thing or two, and that's pretty much universal. To wrap this video up, I want to speak briefly on the future of Japanese martial arts specifically. As a disclaimer, I am not a proponent of the idea that history is a predictive tool. Without a doubt, there are certainly patterns in history, but being a good historian and being a future seer are not the same thing. That said, both Judo and Aikido were products of their time. While that isn't exactly a 4,000 IQ profound observation, I do think it gets overlooked pretty often. We are going to continue to see dominant ideologies injected into martial arts spaces purely for the reason that doing so will keep gyms and dojos afloat. Whether we agree with those ideologies and think they're appropriate in martial arts or not. But I also suspect we will see certain traditional elements erode too. Perhaps this is a hot take, but I think the institution of belt ranks will likely weaken in Japan across the next several decades, for example. The reason is really simple. In a social media driven climate, visible demonstration of what a martial art enables you to actually do is likely to become more powerful than a belt color. Even today, it feels like we all know when that ostensibly lower rank person is actually the most skilled person in the room, even if their credentials say otherwise. I also think the aesthetics of mastery are bound to change. In Aikido, perhaps as a holdover from the founder adopting the fashion sense of a Taoist immortal, genuine mastery seems to be reserved for old men. Now, in all fairness, sometimes there is truth in the optics. For example, Aikido claims longevity benefits, and the 95-year-old Hiroshi Tada sensei still performs in the big annual Aikido demonstrations to this day. The man will likely be doing this art until he passes away in his sleep. That certainly isn't nothing. That being said, a glance at Japan's demographic future reveals that the elder master trope likely can't continue at scale anymore. Shirakawa Ryuji sensei, a prominent YouTuber in the Aikido sphere, is 45. While some might say that isn't young, it also isn't 74 or 95. Shirakawa Ryuji sensei's Aikido is also much more dynamic than his peers. He once dyed his hair blonde, something still seen as mildly taboo by conservative elements in Japan, and is generally very popular with the younger generation of Japanese Aikidoka. Times, they are a-changing. Anyway, I hope I've more or less gotten my point across in this video. Knowing history is all about bulletproofing yourself against questionable narratives and creating realistic expectations. Beyond that, sure, it can also be about finding your place in a much grander scheme, but I just have personally met a lot of people who expect a very Western-coded experience when they go into a dojo. While the native culture of wherever that dojo exists is bound to seep in, I think we have to be careful about projecting our expectations onto essentially a foreign experience. It is so common nowadays to run into criticisms about bowing and uniforms and hierarchy and all this stuff. The solution is simple, just don't train at these places, and you will know these places from doing your due diligence. About 30 minutes of time on your phone will tell you all you need to know. Different experiences are going to appeal to different people. For me, I've never been particularly drawn to the sort of narrative I described at the beginning of this video. I've never identified with the scruffy underdog training in a backwater gym to finally make it big. Not because I'm all that well-to-do, but because martial competition has never really appealed to me all that much. I'm much more compelled by the desire to push my body to its own limits and then reap the benefits of that process. I think most competitors are motivated by a sort of freedom through competitive success. I'm just motivated by a sort of freedom through autonomy over my own form. I'm desperately concerned with the possibility of one day feeling trapped in my own body, and that is the arena that I train in. Being defeated in a combat sport isn't really on my radar, but both ways of engaging with martial arts are legitimate. What matters is that we find ourselves informed before we fully commit to whatever training style appeals to us most. The first step in doing so is knowing our preferences, and that is a journey I can't really make a video about for you, other than, of course, for myself. Step 1, though, is identifying what you want out of martial arts. Step 2 is doing your due diligence so you know wherever you train is going to give you the deliverables you're after. And step 3 is train as much as you reasonably and responsibly can. But anyway, I will leave it at that for now. Thank you so much for listening, as always, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.